The Juneau World Affairs Council and the University of Alaska Southeast, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2019 World Affairs Forum, Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World. In this presentation, Deflecting Digital Disinformation, the Inoculating Influence of Procedural News Knowledge, Dr. Eric Busey of Texas Tech University reviews how effective media literacy can give educators and policymakers a useful tool in correcting manipulation by fake news, digital disinformation, and propaganda.
Thanks for that, Carl. Unfortunately, no accent, and I only know English. So I've got a lot to say. This is going to take up most of the hour, and I want to kind of inoculate. I want to apologize up front because there's a fair amount of text on some of the slides. So get ready for it, and here it comes. But to begin with, kind of a lighthearted note, we used to think of fake news before digital disinformation as kind of a satire or almost a tabloid romp. So it was an entertaining diversion. We all understood what it was. And it was there to enjoy, and it was there to kind of make fun of. Of course, that took a turn, and we can kind of think about the various stages of progression of digital disinformation, but certainly late 2015, early 2016 was kind of an inflection point. Now we've got distinctions between misinformation, disinformation, fake news. People say not to use the fake news title because it's used politically. I think it's still very convenient, and so I use it. But we want to think about intentionality. So with disinformation, there's a particular intent on the message sender, strategic communicator, to really either confuse or to discount or undermine known facts. And so we want to keep that in mind. And one other thing related to kind of the comment about post-truth here, so a lot of times the outcome of a disinformation campaign, it may be informational, but it may also be emotional. And the emotional thing may actually be more consequential. And if you think about different emotions, one of them might be confusion, or another one might be disorientation, or even a feeling of being overwhelmed. So all these themes are going to come up a little bit later in my talk. Now, fake news or kind of invented storytelling in journalism is nothing new. And our first speaker yesterday, David, really hit on that point. And I think it's important to understand this is a historical, even an ancient phenomenon. There's a issue of Lapham's Quarterly out on fake news. And they've got an image of a Roman kind of emblem, and it's the mouth of truth. And the symbolism is that it's supposed to bite off the hands of liars. So it's not a new problem, and it's a particularly pernicious problem. This is going back to the inflection point I mentioned, and how something seemed to change, seemed to accelerate, seemed to amplify in late 2015. And I came across this on the national NPR site, and the columnists basically, and in conjunction with the news staff, decided it wasn't effective anymore just to have a single column trying to combat what they were calling then hoax sites, basically all the different forms of fake news that were out there. It was starting to become overwhelming, starting to become more algorithmic. And she had a great phrase for it. She called it the industrialization of the hoax news industry. And so it wasn't possible at a human scale or human pace to kind of keep up with it anymore. So this is one of the themes I relate fake news to, which is big data. And I'll talk about that a little bit here. But one of the problems is volume, but another problem is velocity. And as human processes, our system gets overwhelmed pretty quickly, which is therefore easy to kind of defeat. So the fake news gets through, and we accept a lot more of it than we might otherwise consider. So, I just wanted to point out some good work being done out there to try to track and counter this, and the Oxford Internet Institute is one of them. They've got a big project ongoing on computational propaganda, which I think is a great phrase for what we're encountering now. I do think there's utility to the phrase propaganda, and I do think that's a lot of what we're actually encountering. Disinformation kind of softens it, misinformation even more, fake news even more. It's just propaganda. And the way I understand that is if it's communicated with a strategic political intent. The sad part about computational propaganda is a lot of it is directed towards domestic audiences, and it's not just an international phenomenon, although our systems now are porous to outside influence. So it's a whole new reality that we have to deal with. And of course, we're just accessing our Facebook accounts or our Twitter feed, and it doesn't seem like we're in the middle of an information war, but we really are. And that's hard for, I would say, the everyday citizen to kind of realize. So you might have seen this article in BuzzFeed or heard about this finding, but Craig Silverman did a little analysis, and he looked at the top 20 performing stories on Facebook, and he looked at the actual news versus the fake news, and he looked at the number of shares and kind of the media engagement around those approaching Election Day 2016. And in the closing weeks, he found that fake news articles were circulating and getting retweeted and posted more than actual news. And so is this a problem? Yes, it's a huge problem. Even if we kind of know that it doesn't have a truth value and it's kind of put up there for sensationalist purposes, the mere circulation of it increases the chance that it's going to be accepted. And then if it's accepted and kind of top of mind, then it might have an influence on your attitudes and behavior. Now, showing that and demonstrating that causality is difficult. So a lot of people say, well, there is no good empirical research saying that fake news really influenced in a concrete way or determined the 2016 election. On the other hand, I would say there's no real study saying it didn't have at least some influence. And so I see it as a huge problem. And of course, when we get to kind of the upper Midwest and it comes down to 78,000 votes, I think it starts to become more plausible. So I don't want to make a strong argument either way, but I think it's highly problematic. And it's not just in the U.S. So if you're paying attention to international media, it's like almost every Democratic election now has to have this brace for it moment. Here it comes. Get ready for it. I hope it doesn't influence the outcome. It's an astonishing moment in Western democracy. So here, New York Times piece, Italy's bracing for fake news. The recent election in Brazil, they were worried about fake news, and not just on Facebook or Twitter accounts that are semi-public, but now in WhatsApp applications that are really private. And there was a lot of influence campaigns going on there. Latest American export to the world, Steve Bannon and kind of Trump world. But thankfully, there are some cases where there's enough kind of proactive countermeasures where it doesn't have an effect. And I'd also say some nice laws and policies in place, like a blackout on campaigning the last few days of an election. In places like France, where the Macron campaign was very aware of a lot of the disinformation going on, warned the public, had countermeasures to try to deflect the bots and deflect the algorithms and the outside influencers into what they call honeypots. So, discussion boards or threads that look like they were real and related to the campaign, but were actually innocuous and harmless. So to try to redirect the bots. And then they warned the public that, just like in Italy, this is coming, watch out for it, and it didn't have an effect. So I think there's ways to inoculate there too, and I think it has to be communicated publicly. And the campaigns also really need to be digitally sophisticated. Again, it's not just a visible public persuasion process anymore. There's a lot of behind the scenes, and there's a lot of digital elements to it. So here we are with dictionary.com's definition of disinformation. And, you look at the first definition, it has more to do with a country's military strength or plan, but false information. So it's kind of the older definition. And now we have the newer definition, which is deliberately misleading or biased information, manipulated narrative or facts, or just straight out propaganda. So I kind of agree with that. Now, there's degrees of disinformation or degrees of fake news. And there's been some great scholarly work on this, doing what they call typologies of bad information. So you kind of array it from satire and parody on one side to disinformation, propaganda, and what they call fabrication and manipulation on the other side. So if we take the right side of this, the red side, the truth value goes way down the farther out you get to the margins here. So there's basically no truth value whatsoever in a story or a narrative that's completely fabricated. So this includes wholly invented news reports like the Pizzagate conspiracy or the Obama birther controversy. There's no truth in it at all. It just resonates with what some people want to believe. And so it still can work, but it has no relationship to the truth. And then you get a little bit softer version of it, although no less pernicious in its manipulation, that uses an actual story and then distorts it or selectively reports it or somehow transforms it into something that it's not. So a lot of conspiracies operate in this kind of region. A lot of times there'll be a mass shooting and they might acknowledge the fact, oh, there was a shooting, but it was by somebody wearing, you know, a Democrat hat, or it was by somebody with an agenda. And so they'll try to twist people's understanding of it. And it used to be that this would take days or weeks for the reinterpretation to happen. And now it's happening, you know, within minutes. So almost as soon as something emerges in kind of the disinformation sphere, there's this active campaign to try to reinterpret it and confirm people's biases and therefore contribute to division and disagreement. Now, on the honest side of this, there's honest misinformation, and that is anybody who's worked as a reporter, I've worked as a reporter, knows that it's an imperfect process. Sometimes you make mistakes. I mean, this could be as small as misspelling somebody's name, to getting an address wrong, to misreporting a score or a vote. But you correct it with a correction, or if it's really bad, you retract it. But this is part of the process. So this is where people get uncomfortable with using the fake news label, because if there's even an honest mistake, it'd be labeled sometimes by political actors as fake news. Well, it's not fake at all. It's just the human process of not getting everything absolutely perfect under real-time pressure. And then there's completely accurate reports that are very well documented that are dismissed as fake news. So it's real news dismissed as fake. Again, because it's disfavorable to, the authority figure, the politician in office, the governmental agency that doesn't like it, the foreign power that wants to deny it. And this is having, again, a similar kind of influence where even though the truth value is maximal, they can make political gains by labeling it. And if information that's labeled in a negative way isn't countered, then a lot of times the label sticks. And this is the basic function of negative advertising. Everybody says they don't like it. I don't want to watch it. But then it gets your attention, and then the candidate's smeared with a certain accusation or a certain bad development that happened. And unless that's met with equal positive information, it tends to work on people. And there's classic cases in American presidential politics about this. If you remember Dukakis in '88, and he was kind of associated with some what were portrayed as lenient prison policies. And then there's John Kerry in 2004, and suddenly you get a decorated war veteran who seems like, well, maybe he was a war criminal instead. And in each case, they waited and they stalled. They said, I don't want to engage on that level. And the negative information stuck. And by the time they did rally, it was too late. So one of my themes is that this stuff has to be countered. It can't just be ignored. So here's back to the emotional outcome. So what does all this do fundamentally? It may seem like it's a cognitive process of getting you to think in a different way, or I didn't realize that possibility, or is that true? But fundamentally, it's to unsettle you emotionally so that you become less able and less certain about acting in a particular direction. And so, we're becoming aware of this. You can ask people, is it confusing you? And they'll say yes. But we need to treat this as a real problem as opposed to just kind of that's a curious survey finding. Hadn't thought about that. All right, let me go back to my Facebook feed. That's not going to help. So I think we need to do something about this. I've got a suggestion later on. And of course, if it gets really bad, people do take this literally, right? If your feed, if your information, if your bubble is all telling you something that's patently ridiculous is true, you might actually go take action on it. We had a similar situation. I grew up in the South Bay area of Los Angeles, so it's kind of a beach community. And it got infamous for a little while in the mid-'80s for what was called the McMartin preschool case. And this was almost like an 80s version of Pizzagate. So supposedly there was a basement where satanic rituals were going on and preschool kids were getting, kind of molested by the owners of the place. And I mean, as false as can be, but they drove them basically out of the town. They shut the business. And even after they were gone, they used bulldozers to dig to see if there was any signs or remnants of what had happened. Nothing. It was just absolutely nothing. So this, again, has happened prior to the digital era. Let's go back to the emotion piece of this. So Elizabeth Arnold showed this in relation to her talk last night on the 6 different Americas that kind of have different views on global warming. Well, the point I want to make here is look at the terms used. These are basically emotional states. Certainly alarmed, concerned could be an adjective for or a synonym for anxiety. Caution is when you're very careful about approaching something. Disengage, you start to be bored, doubtful, you start to become skeptical, cynical, and then dismissive is you don't want to hear it, but it's also a way, it's kind of an emotional protection of, that's not a problem. So I think even though these aren't all kind of pure emotions, it performs a very valuable service in showing that this emotional kind of orientation that information can have, or that an attitude about a policy or a politician can have, is a very effective way of segmenting the audience. And I think sometimes a lot more effective than, just political party, which is, pretty binary in the US, and even ideology. So I'm starting to think about disinformation and emotional states in kind of a similar continuum, only I'm going to array it in a simpler fashion with just 3 states, represented by your favorite movie character here. But you take the disinformation ecosystem and people's engagement with it, and I think there's a reliable set of people who are truly alarmed by it, which I think is a rational response, is a rational emotional response, if that makes sense, to a real problem out there in the public sphere. A lot of people, as the Pew data showed, are just simply confused by it, and that might be the biggest group, right? And this is going to cross over, I think, different party lines. It's not just Democrats are alarmed and just Republicans are in denial. Anybody kind of in the center and has, considers issues on both sides, I think is going to feel these emotions. And then there's denial, and it relates not only to political figures, but also issues in the public sphere. So one of my colleagues at Texas Tech is researching flat Earth beliefs. And an amazing amount of denial of the science and denial of and kind of dismissiveness of any research that they can't confirm with their own eyes. So there's this strange kind of belief in system of assessment that if you can't see it, and if all the data depends on the NASA program, well, then why should I trust it? Because I can't verify it myself. It's a really interesting technique for getting people to abandon what have been, decades of just uncontested assumption. And now through the YouTube kind of rabbit hole, it's sowing enough doubt and confusion that some people actually embrace it. All right, so I think these are the 3 primary groups. Now, Just to have a little bit of fun of it with this, I did a Star Wars edition. So we can call it the Disinformation Death Star now. And I think Anakin Skywalker there is in the most denial about his position. Okay, now let's go to fake news as a big data problem. And if you read about big data, there used to be 3 V's. Now there's 4 V's. I would even say there's 5 V's. The top 3 are the ones we used to worry about. So, and this was mostly from how to gain leverage out of them, how to figure out what they were telling us about all the different data points they represented, whether it's social media, or whether it's the Internet of Things, and the way people are kind of adjusting even things as mundane as thermostats. But if it's all linked back to a central data source, what does that tell us? So there's an incredible amount of volume of data that we can now collect through cybernetic means. There's a lot of variety to it, so it's hard to parse. It takes a lot of computer expertise, and it's coming at us constantly in incredible velocity. But now we've got the problem of veracity, which is whether it's truthful or not. And this particularly pertains to social media and other digital platforms. So I see these platforms as basically big data kind of vehicles. And so there becomes another problem with social media, which is the visibility, or really the invisibility of how they operate. And with analog media, newspapers or broadcasting, for instance, where the station is, where the media headquarters is, what they produce. You have a pretty good sense of what goes on there, even if you're not in the newsroom. With the digital platforms, you don't have a sense of what the algorithm is, what the programming is, who's doing it, from where, and where the data is stored and how many different servers there are. I mean, there's a lot of lack of visibility with these things. So in regards to this, I did some focus groups out at Texas Tech. I have my graduate students go out and interview 5 friends or family, and I do it almost every semester. So one year we did it on fake news and disinformation, and one of the participants said the readers can't decide between what's real and what's not, and in that situation it's just easier to believe what you read. Okay, so that's the veracity problem. And let me kind of move along here, but this is kind of a complicated chart, but real quickly, if the bottom row is user competencies from low to high, and the top row is platform complexity from low to high. When you're a low-end user, you're nicely calibrated with the low-end technology, basic text or maybe the phone or something like that. As your sophistication goes up, so does your calibration. And then when you get to the high end of it, you're calibrated not only with the most advanced technology, but with every kind of less complex technology. So that works great if you're a high-end user. On the other hand, if you're a low-end or end user, then you're not calibrated after a certain point. In other words, you don't even understand what's really going on with the system. And that's how some of this works, is it takes advantage of people's kind of trust in a platform. All right, so I asked my students to ask their participants, have you ever encountered and unintentionally forwarded a piece of fake news, and if so, where? This brings up Matt Damon. Somebody said, well, last year I posted an article that Matt Damon was moving to Lubbock. Lubbock, do you guys know where Lubbock, Texas is? I'll show you. And then I ended up deleting it. I realized it was a trendy thing going around. At first I was like, no way. And then I was like, oh, I believed it for a second. And then somebody else said, oh yeah, I saw it. And then Nick Jonas was moving to Lubbock. I mean, hey, it's the place, right? I mean, look at that. It is central to everything and proximate to nothing. It's 5 hours to Austin, 6 really, and 5 hours to Albuquerque and Santa Fe. All right, so why does this happen? Why do people believe it? And is it possible to reject information? So Daniel Gilbert, who's now at Harvard, did some really interesting work when he was at UT Austin. And this is before digital, or at least social media. And he's a psychologist, and he looked at whether people would readily believe something that was just completely made up. So he didn't use the term fake news, but he had all these headlines and expressions that were basically fake news. And he did a really interesting move, which is he put it in light of Renaissance philosophy. So he said there was a debate between Descartes and Spinoza. And Descartes, of course, is kind of on the cognitive rational end of things and, had the famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. So he thought you could encounter a piece of information and hold it neutrally in your mind, in your awareness, then determine whether it was correct or not. And at that point, you would accept it or reject it. So you hold it neutrally first before you reject it or accept it. And the way he put this is that we have this power to withhold our assent, meaning our agreement, and it must be so evident that this is completely innate to people. And Spinoza came along, and Gilbert pointed all this out, and said, not so much. I don't think so. I think in order to understand something, you basically have to accept that it's true first before you look at the evidence and then decide to reject. And this is what Gilbert was testing. So some ideas may be subsequently unaccepted, but only after this process of verification and kind of investigation. And so Spinoza said, will and intellect are one and the same. You can't accept or you can't hold an idea without either accepting or rejecting it. So Gilbert went through, he did a very elegant series of experiments, and he had the Spinozan procedure, which is where you comprehend and accept before unaccepting, and then he had the Cartesian procedure where you comprehend, hold it neutrally, and then reject. And I won't go into the details of how he did this, but I'm just going to say that he was very kind of prescient in his design because he anticipated interruptions. He included it in his study designs, and it basically mimics multitasking today. And so think about all the interruptions that you have throughout your day when you're trying to read something, when you're trying to answer somebody, when you're trying to watch something, et cetera, et cetera. And what he found was the more that we're interrupted, the more likely we're liable to accept false information, F as T, false as true, the more we're interrupted. When it's true as true, it's easier to figure out. When it's false as false, well, it's even harder to reject it when you're interrupted. And then when it's true as false, it's more or less equal, but it's real problematic when it's false. So we accept it, particularly when it's interrupted. And so he had a kind of a flowery way of writing in these series of pieces. But he says it basically comports with evolution that we have to accept even something outrageous, particularly if it's negative, because it has survival implications. So you're walking along, and particularly out here in Alaska with these great kind of, forests and natural landscapes, and you hear something. Oh, I just ignore it, There can't be any bears around here. And then it is a bear, and it's hungry, and it finds you. So on the other hand, so that would be the Cartesian thing. Well, I don't have enough information, so I'm going to hold it neutral, right? Whereas Spinoza would say, no, that sounds like a bear. In order for me to even process that piece of information, I'm going to take action. I'm going to assume it's true, and therefore I'm not going to run up a tree. I'm going to find a nice hiding spot, maybe back in my car, and that's going to take care of the situation. So the Spinozan hiker survives. The Cartesian hiker doesn't. So beleaguered believers are unable to conduct a full-scale assessment of the propositions that they automatically accept upon comprehension, and thus they continue to regard them as true. This is false information. And I mean, this was wacky stuff. And he would say, so now here's a question about a Texas animal. The favorite food of an armadillo is Philadelphia cream cheese. I don't know, sounds plausible, sure. But the more you're interrupted, the more you accept it, and the less you reject it. So do we reject information that's untrue? Yes, but it requires a high level of implausibility. Cream cheese? Maybe, I don't know. So that's not highly implausible. A high level of attention, which most of us are not paying that close of attention to everything, and a high level of distrust. So it basically holds even in subsequent tests. So we get back to the fake news invasion now, and we've got all these problems with digital media. So I say here the porousness, the opacity, that's the lack of visibility, the anonymity that encourages really extreme and hostile comments, and then the velocity that this is coming at us at. And it seems like one drip at a time, but have you ever tried to get to, like the bottom of a Twitter feed? There doesn't seem to be any end to it. And there's really no end, even with a few hundred friends on Facebook, of the amount of posts that keep coming at you. This is a hard thing to kind of comprehend and figure out a beginning and an end and what you need to know and what you don't. So I see it as a big data problem. What this does is it leaves a lot of people with a false sense of knowing and accepting information that really is on that nil end of the truth scale. But again, going back to my focus groups, viewers are confident, or media users are confident they can counter this onslaught. They don't want to think it's the whole cause is lost. So they say we just need to be aware of what's really real and what's not, and how many sources are out there that can't be trusted, and just take the time to be more mindful about what you're actually reading and what you're actually posting. Of course, we all do that, right? We never just forward something without reading it. We always look to whether it's important and consequential. No, of course we don't do that. So, there's this kind of contrast between what's coming at us and maybe our best intentions, but then the constant pressure of lack of time, lack of attention, distractions, and other things that characterize modern society. So the problem seems to be getting a lot worse. And then this is not even to really get into some of the political kind of framing of this stuff, and then confirmation bias and other selective processes that really veer us towards certain information that seems more favorable. Okay, now, that's all bleak, and that's pretty depressing, but what's a potential solution? And, as an educator, of course, I'm going to say more education, but a particular kind of education. And I think it has to be, in the end, more experiential than book learning, and certainly something that you do more than you just hear about. But again, just to go to a basic definition, what's knowledge? Knowledge is the fact or state of knowing, the perception of fact or truth, a clear and certain mental apprehension. Now, I'm going to apply this to media. What do we know about mainstream media? What knowledge is actually out there? And I bring this up because it's a hunch I've had for a long time. It's the one thing I can thank the fake news era for kind of delivering, like right into my inbox, which is a really convenient thing to measure with a scale I'd been working on news knowledge. And before fake news came around, I would have these arguments with reviewers and other people in the academe, and they would say, well, we have education level, and that kind of explains sophistication, and we have political knowledge if you want to get into public affairs. So that's basically all we need. And I just had this hunch that wasn't enough. And then fake news comes along, and suddenly my scale has a whole new purpose. And it's not really my scale. It was developed by other people and asked about in surveys going back to the early 80s, but nobody's been systematically working with it, although it's a piece of media literacy. So here's the problem with media, among others, that a lot of people have very strong views about it, and it's easy to hold an opinion about the media, right? And of course, it's less often a particular publication or news outlet than it is kind of the generalized grouping. But all right, let's take that opinion, but then ground it with some facts. What do you actually know about the media? And here I'm talking mainstream media. So many people are quick to express their views, but far fewer can say how the press as an institution actually operates. And it's a similar problem with government, right? It's very easy to hold opinion about the government. What do you actually know about legislation, governing, and coalition building and things like this? But I think we need to be aware of it, and particularly in light of this psychological effect, which is called the Dunning-Kruger effect after the researchers, and that is the tendency for people with the least amount of expertise to be the most confident in their level of knowledge about whatever it is. And you can do a search on this, and it pertains to programming, it pertains to media, and it pertains to politics, and it pertains to science. Those flat earthers are absolutely confident in what they think they know about the earth. And so we can put Ron Burgundy at the very top of that, at the apex of that. And what happens here is that as your knowledge and experience in the field or in the domain increases, then your confidence eventually goes back up along with your true expertise. But that in survey after survey, you see that people who know the least through factual questions are the most likely to overestimate their actual expertise. And they're not even aware that they're overestimating. They just think this is like, I'm good at it. Like I use it all the time. So it's a huge problem. And I think now we need to apply it to media. And that hasn't been done so much. So here are a couple of the counter arguments. Why not just use political knowledge? Because political science has been doing that. And even if you don't know about politics, well, general education, if you have a college degree in particular, seems to work as a proxy for overall sophistication. That's fine, but I don't think every question could be answered with, whether you know who's on the Supreme Court or who's got the majority in Congress right now. Moreover, if the information has a partisan slant to it, again, is your process knowledge of the political system going to prevent you from accepting something that makes you feel good and reinforces your beliefs? So I think you can have process knowledge of politics, but it doesn't necessarily parse information that is true or not because of the political dimension of it. So I think we've come to this era where it's really time to give media influence its due as a separate kind of entity from politics, and that it might be something very positive to develop in this fight against fake news and digital disinformation. It requires kind of a media-centric outlook, which I've always had, and what that does is it gives you an appreciation for the audience. And you think about the level of sophistication and the general citizenry, and even in countries that are advanced, industrialized countries, it's rare to get over 35% of the population with a 4-year degree. And that's true in the US, and it's true in other Western democracies. Smaller countries sometimes can pull off a higher rate, but you can't assume widespread media literacy. So another thing I research are nonverbals and visuals in politics, because I think they're more accessible to everybody. But a media orientation gets you focused on what the audience, what kind of resources and who the audience actually is. All right, so there's another little problem with current measures, and that is from the media side. Well, why don't we just ask people what media they consume? What sounds like an easy question until you go down to write down, like, well, accurately list everything you've been exposed to and read and watched and listened to in the past week. And that's a daunting task. And most people aren't good at it. And it's not so much that they lie or that they want to present themselves in a more positive light. Marcus Pryor did some excellent work on this at Princeton. It's that the memory is faulty. So they're not presenting a strategic sense of self. Well, I watch PBS all the time. There's a little bit of that. But it's more that they can't remember. So we have a problem even tracking basic media use. Now you think DVRs would solve that problem, but the cable companies aren't real keen to share all that data with us because it's proprietary. So when people answer surveys, they tend to over-report their public affairs news consumption, their attention to individual stories, and their motivation and interest for following stories. So it's kind of like the Dunning-Kruger effect, but applied to how much they're engaging with hard news out there. And they're not good at remembering that. All right, so along come these articles in the 80s, and very simple kind of titles. Just love the practicality here. Public Understanding of How the News Media Operate. Another one in Public Opinion Quarterly, very prestigious journal in public opinion. Believability in the press. This is where these questions come out of. And they were fielded back then by the Times Mirror Center, which kind of morphed into the Pew Center. Before Pew, there was Times Mirror in LA. That's where I'm from. So what do these questions look like? What am I talking about? News knowledge. So I think of it as news process in terms of how the news is produced, but also what it looks like. So how do you know it when you see it? So here's a question. In what section does a newspaper's editorial staff endorse candidates and express their opinions? Well, 61% of the people we asked in this particular survey got that right. But if you look at the distribution here, you have a lot of people at the lower end, and then you had a lot of people at the higher end. And of course, this is an average, and it's not true in every case, but it kind of represents what's going on out there. There's a lot of people who don't know, and there's some people that do know. And some people think, well, it's done on the front page. You endorse a candidate on the front page. Well, yeah, I guess the tabloids do that. We're talking about mainstream media, and I make that clear in the questionnaire. 5% think you endorse candidates in a special weekly advertising section, and 13% said newspapers don't endorse candidates. I suppose a small percentage of newspapers don't. Some do. Here's another question. And so this can't rely on just a handful of questions, although a handful of questions can work. But now in my surveys, I asked I have a battery of 30 questions, out of which I randomly present 8 questions. So each person gets a different random selection of questions. Which of the following outlets does not depend primarily on advertising for financial support? A bare majority got that right, 52%. And almost 38% didn't know. When it comes to reporting the news, the main difference between websites like Google and a website like CNN is that what? Google doesn't have reporters, CNN does. But an equal number, or actually more, didn't know the difference. They didn't know that essentially Google was a news aggregator with no reporters or real editing staff, and CNN was actually a legitimate news organization. Okay, that's problematic. And you can think about some of the other things I've been talking about in relation to that. Most media outlets in the US are for-profit businesses, but 1/3 didn't really know that. So, here it will vary depending on the specific question, but I'm going to show you some data from the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford. They asked 3 questions, 3 similar questions across 18 countries. And man, does that tell the difference between what people do online and what they don't. I'll show you in a second here. So, can news knowledge inoculate? That's essentially how I want to set it up. I think particularly if you're socialized into the news, if you've ever been a reporter, probably taken any journalism, you know what news is. It's almost, it's so learned, it's almost instinctual to know what fake news is. You're going to question it. You're going to discount it. You're going to look for the little tiny clues that an industry insider would. If you haven't had that socialization, it's much easier to convince you that something might be true. All right, so here's some of the Reuters data, and here's the question. Which of the following news outlets does not primarily depend on advertising for financial support? It's the public broadcaster. They got a similar result, about 52% across 18 countries recognize that, but look at that, 34% don't know. I think it's important in all my surveys moving forward, I've got to ask the don't know option. Okay, moving on. Which of the following is typically responsible for writing a press release? Spokesperson for an organization, that's the right answer. A reporter for a news organization, 25% of people thought reporters write press releases. So I write my own press release and put it in the paper, right? That's how it works. A producer for a news organization, a lawyer for a news organization, 28% don't know. How are most of the individual decisions about what news stories to show people on Facebook made? So now you have to mix it in with some digital social media type of questions. They're made by computer analysis of what stories might be of interest. In other words, the algorithmic answer, that's correct. By editors and journalists, nope. At random, or 40%, that's the majority or the plurality response, don't know. So this is the opacity I was talking about, the lack of visibility. Information just appears. It's just on my phone. What are you talking about? Okay, so here they kind of array it now. And you get 34% who answer, 32 who answer 0 correct. This is 3 questions across 18 countries. 34% 1, 23% 2, and only 10% across all 18 countries get 3 questions right about mainstream media. I think we have to do better if we want democracy to thrive. So what does this now do kind of from a practical point of view? So they took these responses, and I know these are kind of small, but I'm happy to share these slides afterwards. And they arrayed it by your level of media knowledge, so from low to very high. And what you see is, just look at the endpoints here. Very high, you're much more likely here to read the prestige brands. So they're looking at, this is in the UK, the BBC, and the Guardian. Whereas if you're lower in knowledge about media processes, you're going to be less likely to do that. The next one is in the US, and people at the higher end are more likely to read the New York Times and the Washington Post, and almost none at all down at the low end. Okay, so let's look at a little more here. And this is not in every market, but every market they were able to analyze. And news trust goes down for social media among the people at the highest level, and is generally, I mean, it's kind of equal here, but social media really get questioned, and then news from a search engine. So the algorithmic stuff is really questioned by people who know more about mainstream media. And then the proportion who are extremely concerned about misinformation, and you see generally an upward trend here. So what they find is, there's one more chart I'm going to show you, but that, you know, news experts consume news from a wider range of sources, tends to be more elite in nature, and they rely on a broader range of credibility clues and have higher trust in media. That's all. I think that's pretty interesting. And then they also have a broader range of kind of, you know, heuristics or judgments, kind of judgment cues that they rely on when they look online. So here they're looking at the brand, who's the source. They're not looking at the comments, the shares, and the likes. They really deprioritize that. You know, you think again about the average user. The average user is probably really interested in how many people liked it, or what's trending, or what my friends forwarded. It's not a news expert necessarily. Okay, so I'm going to just go real quickly through what I'm working on, running out of time here. But we're working with the idea of persuasion in kind of suspect content contexts. And what I mean by that is native ads. So here's a native ad. This is an ad for, I think it was a Netflix series, Orange is the New Black. But it looks like a magazine article. In other words, it looks like a feature piece which you could put into a news category. But if you notice at the very top, there's a little announcement there. I forget what that says, but I think it says sponsored. What's that? Paid post. There we go. And then at the bottom, and this isn't just at the bottom of the first screen, this is at the bottom of about 5 screens that you have to scroll down. So you get something at the very top and something at the very bottom. And the bottom is, the news and editorial staff of the Times had no role in this post preparation. Okay, everybody's going to pick up on that, right? When you're harried and busy and distracted and not paying that much attention? Yeah, I don't think so. So we're using inoculation theory and news knowledge to see if knowing about the press will kind of guard against acceptance of information that's suspect. We've done several surveys so far, and let me just walk you through some of the results here, but these are national surveys. And we're using these kind of metrics: news knowledge, media use, cynicism, motivations for news use, and recognition of fake news items, and native advertising. This was the pilot study to kind of determine whether we should continue this line of work or not. How likely are news experts to like a negative ad? They're significantly less likely to like it than somebody low on the scale. a news novice. So we ran the stats. It was significant. How well can news experts spot fake news? A lot better than news novices. This is the expert. This is the novice. How likely are experts to share a native ad? Less. So everything was trending in the right direction. So we continued with it. And here's another example of a native ad, and this is from Chevron, and they're just describing the energy production process in very kind of neutral, positive terms, right? Same kind of disclaimers, but it looks like an informative, again, news feature. Here's one from Cole Haan, I think shoe manufacturer, clothing manufacturer, and it's all about ballet, but it's also a paid post. So these are attempts at persuasion. They're attempts to get you to buy something or to agree to something. So what happens? So news knowledge is associated with, first of all, that this information is suspect and represents a kind of threat. So people higher in news knowledge are going to see it more for what it is and more as a problem than people low in that scale. And that they're more likely to counter-argue with it. And they have a decreased willingness to like and share fake news headlines. But here's the thing, going back to the political piece, even if you have news knowledge, but you're a Trump supporter, then you're going to go in the opposite direction. So political beliefs might actually, or kind of partisanship, will override some of your feelings about this, particularly when the headlines have to do with political topics. What do I mean by that? So here's a bunch of fake news headlines. In the summer of 2018, Trump donated his entire annual salary for rebuilding military cemeteries. False. During the Persian Gulf War in 91, Trump sent his own plane transport 200 Marines who had become stranded. False. So even if you have high news knowledge, but it's about your guy, you're going to disagree with some of this stuff. But for really nothing doing with information, but more political values. Okay, so where are we at with this? And then I'm just going to give you my my suggestion. We found so far that people who are news experts, higher levels of procedural news knowledge, recognize sponsored content, native ads, find it less persuasive, perceive fake news headlines as inaccurate at a higher rate than people low in knowledge, and that they counter-argue with it, suggesting a type of cognitive resilience that I don't like it, I don't trust it, I'm not buying it. And that perhaps it really does serve as a forewarning mechanism against covert persuasion and things that are just out there that should be rejected. And again, we're thinking about it in real time with like moving at a cybernetic pace. I think this has to be ingrained as opposed to just something pointed out in a class or in a seminar or even a talk like this. It's going to take a lot of kind of reorientation. So what's going on out there? There's a lot of stuff going on. People are trying to actively, academics and press institutes are trying to actively make the news a little more transparent, a little more about how they're actually doing the work and why they made certain decisions. I think that's great. But I think ultimately we need to even go beyond that. That's kind of a supply side argument. What do you do about the supply of content and how do you make that better for citizenship and democracy? I think we got to go to the demand side. So I wrote a piece recently for a blog, and I kind of lay out the whole news knowledge argument there. But we kind of overlook it as a pillar of citizenship. Think about everything. Really how little it takes to be a citizen. You need to be born somewhere in a particular country, and then if you want to run for office, you need to be of a certain age. But what makes you an effective citizen? And I would argue increasingly in this kind of messy disinformation age, we're going to have to do more with journalism training. So if you think about English composition, it's required in almost every high school and almost every college. But what does composition really teach you? And this is something we can talk about in the Q&A, but it really teaches you to argue and to assert a point and to make a case. Now, hopefully that's factual, but that's not the primary incentive. The primary goal is to get you to put forward your thesis statement and defend it, right? Well, that sounds a lot like partisanship to me. It even sounds like court cases. My dad was a trial attorney, and he could convince a jury any way he wanted. First of all, you stack the jury, kind of like an election, and then you selectively present the facts, and then you dominate the opposition, then you win your case. You get the jury, the voters, to vote for your side. That doesn't mean it's true. And so what I think we need to do is either substitute or require, in addition to composition and things that train us to argue, including public speaking, I think we got enough argumentation in society. I think we need more listening, more reporting, and more accurate kind of depictions and recounting of reality that's out there. Now, think about it from an experiential point of view. If you're a student and a young person and you're doing this, and you go out and observe an event, you take quotes, and other people are observing the same event, and you come back with bogus or inaccurate quotes, well, your story might not make it past the desk. And the desk is going to consist of your peers. So you can learn at a very early age that any old kind of storytelling isn't going to cut it. You actually have to go out there and report what really happened. And then even if your story does make it past that cut, you might be asked, well, we need to do some fact checking on this. Well, did you get the name right? Well, what happened over there towards the end of the event? Can you call people back? This is what you have to do in a newsroom. And so a story is not cleared to publish until it goes through this vetting process. And a lot of stories don't even make it through that vetting process. Now, if you've gone through that, you understand this kind of implicitly. It's not a case that your perception, interpretation, storytelling ability is going to win the day, although there are some bad actors in journalism, there's no question. But I think if we did this more and required it more, we'd have a little bit less of a problem when it comes to countering digital disinformation. All right, so thanks for listening. I know I went on long. Thanks.
That was Deflecting Digital Disinformation, the Inoculating Influence of Procedural News Knowledge, with Dr. Eric Busey. His talk was recorded on Saturday, March 30th, 2019 at UAS in Juneau, as part of the 2019 Juneau World Affairs Forum. Modern Journalism, the Role of News Media in a Changing World, produced by KTOO and the Juneau World Affairs Council in partnership with the University of Alaska Southeast. With support from AEL&P, Coeur Alaska Kensington Mine, DreamHost.com, Haight & Associates, Sea Alaska, and Wastman & Associates.